Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I apologize about any weirdness that goes on with my voice in today's video and probably the next few as well. I had family over recently and had some other things going on, and I got sick. My throat is not feeling the greatest right now. The last couple of videos where I was starting to feel that a little bit weren't a fluke. It got worse. But I'm making do, have to get a few videos done, so we're recording nonetheless. Today's video is going to be a review of a couple books that I've actually had kind of on the back burner for 1.5 million years at this point. That is Percy Jackson's Greek Gods and Heroes, a couple of side books within the Percy Jackson universe, of course, that are basically just the Percy Jackson style of narration, recounting various different Greek myths, of course being the 12 Olympians and a couple of the other major gods that aren't technically Olympians within the Gods book, and then a solid handful of the most well-known Greek heroes in the Heroes book, plus a few that are a little bit more obscure as well, so that was pretty neat. But yeah, I don't really have much by way of other preamble for this video. It's been a little while since I've read any Riordan, let alone reviewed any Riordan. I was meant to read these books in the middle of like 2025 or something like that, maybe even early 2025, and it took until mid-2026 before that happened, so that kind of goes to show what my reading schedule has been like for the last little while. And finally, as one final note before we get into things, this is my last sort of auxiliary Riordan reviews before I get into, actually reading some of his proper series again. I have a couple more of those to get through, so that means that I need to do this video first. So let's go ahead and jump on into it. Now, most of my reviews at this point are kind of structured in the good, the bad, the ugly, and then I go into a recommendation. Today's review is going to be slightly different in that I'm going to do the Gods and just kind of review this book in general, then the Heroes and review this book in general, and then I'm going to move on to a sort of recommendation that combines some points and, talks about the two of them together in some sense afterwards. All that being said, what do I think about Percy Jackson's Greek Gods, the first one of these side books? Well, I gotta say, when it follows the chronology early on, I think that this is actually a really solid book, mostly because Greek mythos in and of itself is really good, really interesting, and something that I've always really enjoyed learning and reading more about. When this book, tries to tie the stories of the gods together with some sort of sense and coherency, some sense of cohesive structure, I guess, the book is also quite good, because again, this is Percy Jackson's narration basically just recounting the major aspects of the myths associated with the Olympians and a couple of the other major Greek gods. Unfortunately, Percy Jackson's Greek Gods is kind of held back by the fact that Riordan kind of loses the plot, so to speak, at some point in the book and just kind of goes at it randomly by the time it gets about halfway through, meaning that the structure kind of stops making sense. The very early portions of the book are kind of, like I mentioned, the chronology. When the chronology makes sense, it goes into some of the origins of the Greek gods, and then it goes into telling the stories of all those gods individually. And so the first handful of chapters, so to speak, are structured in a way that makes very good sense, right? It just flows and reads very properly and sort of naturally, right? But once that structure kind of stops being the main focus point, once you don't really have that to rely upon because you're having to tell the stories of the Olympians, individually, and all of those being kind of intertwined and wrapped with one another, it just becomes a little bit hard to care, strangely enough, about what some of those stories are actually doing. These stories are, as I've said, they're told per entity, not necessarily chronologically, even though the book very much starts in that sort of chronological sense. So you get the sense that you're reading one type of thing, and then it becomes gradually more into a different type of thing. And while that's kind of inherent to the structure, what's going on if you look at the chapter list, right? Like you go through and you see the listing of the names of the different gods and which one you're reading about, so the entire thing isn't just some chronology of Greek mythos. It's not that complex, obviously, but it still feels very weird when you have something that feels very cohesive and smooth in the telling, and then you're just suddenly jumping around between things pretty haphazardly and without much care put into it. In addition, the sort of incomplete approach to some of the tales, to the way that Riordan covers some of these gods is also technically fine. You know, the major stuff is most of what this is covering. It's not trying to go into too much detail overall, but like I said, it just kind of becomes a little difficult to care a little bit after a while. Or at least that was just my impression of it. You know, to Riordan's credit, he did manage to include some little stories related to a few of the gods that were stuff that I either didn't know or had forgotten about a long time ago. So there's little tidbits of information here or there that's just like, oh, that's cool. I didn't actually know about that. But I just wish that there was a little bit more surprise and a little bit more, you know, intentionality to the structure of this, because the first half of it does feel pretty intentionally structured, going from one god to the other in the first few of them, you know, in a way that makes sense, but then it just doesn't really try to anymore, and it's like, well, now I feel like I'm just reading a handful of just random shorts telling me about the gods, and like that's what the book is. But again, it does so in a much more coherent fashion early on than it does later on, so I just didn't really care by the end of the book, which is very, very strange. The grand total of the experience of Percy Jackson's Greek Gods is that it is very much, you know, by the books as far as major Greek gods' origins go. You know, when you're just recounting those myths again and doing it from Percy Jackson's narration, this is perfectly suitable. It is totally fine in that way. It's not going to do anything that's going to wow anybody who knows that much about these stories already. But I think the real issue, or my personal gripe with Greek gods specifically, comes down to actually the Percy Jackson side of things. You know, Percy Jackson's recounting of the Greek gods, his voice in this context doesn't actually totally work for me. You know, in his own series within Percy Jackson and the Olympians, of course, with his own books, it's totally fine, especially given, you know, the modernisms related to the setting, the fact that it takes place in modern day America, despite, you know, dealing with the Greek gods. Kind of, I guess, sort of hijacks those myths and recontextualizes them into modern America, and also, you know, handles them in a way that just, again, kind of makes sense with that setting. But trying to do that whole sort of modern style of analogies and the slight irreverence of tone that just kind of inherently comes with Percy Jackson's narration, I don't think fully works for this type of book, at least so far as the gods are concerned. If you want decent retellings of these myths for middle schoolers or people who are already fans of Percy Jackson, it totally works in that kind of sense. But for basically anybody else, I just don't think it really does anything to set itself apart other than that Percy Jackson narration, and in my opinion, that narration style just kind of didn't work. You know, like I said, that sort of irreverent tone, it's something that's like, if I'm reading about the original myths related to the Greek gods, having so many of those modernisms and those types of jokes thrown in, just for whatever reason didn't really fit for me as far as this book was concerned. So that's my basic opinion on the Greek gods. The Greek heroes, however, I definitely feel a good bit different about, because, you know, I went into this still rather curious, despite being a little bit lukewarm to Greek gods overall. But I also was curious because I felt like the Greek heroes is, in some sense, inherently a little bit different. You know, these are stories about different heroes within Greek mythos, where, you know, the weirdness that I felt with regards to a chronology or whatever, we're hopping between different stories and whatnot, wouldn't bother me as much this time around, because I kind of know all the tales of these heroes are more or less separate from one another in a way that the stories of a lot of the gods aren't necessarily separate. So the lack of cohesion in Greek gods bothered me, where I knew that it probably wouldn't bother me in Greek heroes, because, again, the context would be different. And furthermore, the modernisms, the type of tone and stuff that I mentioned that bothered me in the Greek gods was also something that I didn't think would distract me as much in the Greek heroes, and that basically ended up being true. I think that using that tone with the heroes makes sense in a way that it doesn't with the gods, because these are just people from ancient Greece for all intents and purposes, for the most part, as opposed to the Greek gods, where these are more or less like deific type of figures, where I think there's just a an inherent difference in the tone of how these characters are covered, or should be covered, that meant that the tone of Greek gods bothered me, whereas Greek heroes didn't bother me. So, that was kind of my expectation, my curiosity, and like I said, that was basically the case of how I felt about this upon actually reading it. I do think that Percy's tone in the narration works a lot better for these characters, though it is in basically every sense the same thing. They are written in largely the same way. I did find that a lot more fitting in the Greek heroes, and so I wound up actually enjoying the active reading experience a lot more in that sense. And there's also, I'm not going to say that Greek Heroes is suddenly perfect where Greek Gods wasn't, right? There's still a little bit of the same ordering problems, like I said, at times, where I think that there are a couple stories in the Greek Heroes where Percy kind of hints at one of the other stories that he's going to be telling at. And so I think that there are a couple of stories in here that maybe aren't in the order that I personally would have put them in, but it's far less of an issue than it was in the Greek Gods, where basically the entire back half of that book was just felt like it just kind of got thrown into a blender and placed there however it was. I think that Hercules' story in particular would have fit a little bit better at the very end, or there's a couple other places where it might not have been too bad to put it in. But overall, I think that the jumping around within the Greek heroes was a lot less distracting, and Riordan did a lot better job of using the narration to actually reference some of the past stories more often than trying to say, oh yeah, we'll cover that story later, because we'll cover that story later happens a lot in Greek gods and doesn't happen as much in Greek heroes. In Greek heroes, it's more often, making reference to one of the past stories that we've already heard about. And in that sense, it, like I said, just overall worked a lot better. It didn't bother me nearly as much. And relatedly, some of the stories picked out for the Greek heroes, I think were rather thoughtful when it comes to this collection. You still have some of the more popular ones like Perseus and Theseus, of course, makes an appearance, Hercules, Jason and the Argonauts. So they're like a handful of really, well-known Greek myths in here. But some of the other ones like Psyche, who isn't necessarily super unknown, all things considered, but maybe is a little bit more under the radar compared to some of the others. But there are some here that I didn't even think that I actually knew about, like Atrera, being the founder of the Amazons. Atalanta, I had basically forgotten around. Cyrene, Orpheus, some of these myths that are just names that I know, but I don't think I actually knew the myths. And then some of the myths that I did know about, even Jason and Perseus are told with a little bit more detail to the stories in ways that are just oh yeah, I didn't even think I knew about this aspect of the myth. And some of that stuff is going to be the Percy Jacksonisms, right? But there are some aspects of the myths themselves that I just wasn't actually familiar with those details of them, and looking into them after the fact and where some of those details originated from, it's just oh yeah, that's pretty cool. I didn't think I actually knew that part of that hero's myth. So in a lot of ways, Greek heroes just was a lot more enjoyable to me because I was actually learning a little bit with it. Whereas Greek gods, there were a couple of very brief snippets, maybe a handful of pages at a time, that were just oh yeah, that very little bit of that story related to that god. I don't think I knew that story. That's cool. But that only happened a handful of times. Greek heroes, that happened with a few of the heroes just throughout their entire story, but it also happened even with some of the more popular ones, with some of the details that I just didn't even know about prior, because I hadn't looked into them that deeply. I know quite a bit about the Olympians, right, but not as much about all of the heroes necessarily. And so I just really found myself way enjoying Percy Jackson's Greek heroes a heck of a lot more, and so that kind of worked out, right? It is still largely that book of Greek myth retellings the same way that Greek gods is, but rather than feeling like a sort of waste of time because I was already so familiar with it or whatever, I felt like it definitely encouraged a little bit of deeper exploration in me in a way that the Greek gods didn't. I wasn't driven to continue after the Greek gods. I mostly read Greek heroes just out of curiosity, but now I want to read more into Greek mythos in detail with other recountings, other retellings, and other, origins of some of these stories as well, on account of reading Heroes, where it's just like, you know what, now I want to read Edith Hamilton's mythology. Now I want to read, what's his name? Is it Stephen Fry? It might be somebody else. Ovid's Metamorphoses, of course, as well. So, there are various different tellings of some of the Greek mythology that it's just like, I should read more into this, learn more about it, get more into this again, because I just love this kind of stuff. And the fact that I don't do more reading within the realm of it just kind of dumbfounds me every single time, because every single time I read more, almost, I just enjoy it more, with Greek gods being the exception, because I didn't get much of anything new out of that particular book. But that's going to take us into the recommendations of this video. What do I think about whether other people should read Greek gods or heroes? Well, I do think that these, collectively, just kind of enjoined together, tonally, stylistically, whatever it is that you want to call it, I do think that these are a great way to approach some of the original myths with regards to Greek mythology, some of the more popular heroes, of course, all the Olympians, that kind of thing. For fans of Percy Jackson and the Olympians and other Rick Riordan stuff, it is a pretty solid way to give yourself a good introduction to what some of those myths are originally, right? There are some of the modernisms, there are some of those jokes and whatnot that come through with Percy Jackson's narration that do distract from that a little bit to a degree, right? And that bothered me in Greek gods, for example, like I've talked about throughout this video. But overall, in general, there is certainly the fact that if you're not super familiar with these myths, if you're somebody who just happens to read Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and you don't know basically anything else about Greek mythology, both of these books are going to do quite a bit for you, actually. You'll learn a lot, even beyond what you get through osmosis by reading that series or whatever, right? So, obviously the modernisms affect the tone, like I said, but to a degree, I do think that that is basically okay, because it is Percy Jackson's Greek gods and heroes. That's part of the gimmick for these specific books, as a means for fans of Riordan to start exploring those ideas, especially for the younger fans. These are really great for that kind of purpose. However, the implicit other side of the coin here is that if you already know a lot about Greek mythos, especially with regards to the gods themselves, these likely won't do a ton for you overall. The heroes might do more for you than the gods will, like was certainly the case for me. They probably won't wow you to too significant of a degree in either case anyway, but I do think that they're good fun nonetheless. I'm not super likely to recommend Greek gods on its own, just because, I think most people know enough about the Olympians and whatnot that this particular rendition of those stories isn't really going to push the needle a whole lot, but that might just be my bias and how much I already knew about them. Not sure, but on the other hand, I do think that Greek Heroes is one that I'm a lot more willing to recommend on its own as a way to start exploring some of the more well-known Greek heroes in their myths in a way that is very, very accessible, all things considered. So, in the end, I should probably reread some of the other retellings and recommend those instead, like I've kind of mentioned here, but I think that for the purpose of what these are doing, they're fine. I would recommend checking out Greek Heroes. Greek Gods is probably more of a, if you or someone knows basically nothing about the mythos, but enjoys Percy Jackson and the Olympians, it's fine. Greek Heroes is a little easier to recommend. So that's going to be my basic verdict of sorts for this video. That's that. As I said at the start, I'm finally ready to read a proper Rick Riordan series again. It's been a little while since I've done that, as I read, the Demigod Diaries and Demigod Files back in early 2025. I was going to read both of these not too long afterwards so that I could jump into Magnus Chase as my next actual series from Riordan. I need to read Magnus Chase and Trials of Apollo, so both of those are on the docket. I do have the Magnus Chase trilogy scheduled for this summer / this year, generally speaking. I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't quite work out. We will certainly see about that because of a bunch of buddy reads that I have going on for the next handful of months. But yeah, this is just kind of the last of the little auxiliary Rick Riordan related reviews before I do move on to the next series. So maybe you'll see another Riordan video on the channel later this year, maybe early next year, depending on when I can get Magnus Chase read. But because that is on the docket, that is what I'm looking forward to doing. in either case, that is definitely the end of this video. I appreciate you for watching if you did. If you are somebody who has read either of these books, I would definitely be interested to hear what your thoughts were in the comments below. But in either case, I hope you enjoyed the video. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.